Welcome back to another episode of the Register's Kettle podcast. I'm Reg reporter Brandon Vigliarolo, and with me this week are systems editor Tobias Mann and senior reporter Tom Claburn to talk about some experiments they've been doing with AI coding assistants, but not just any AI coding assistant, mind you. We're talking about local ones that live right on your own machine. Guys, thanks for joining me this week.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So before we jump into, what you learned during these experiments and how effective local large language models actually are as coding assistants, let's talk a bit about why we're having this discussion in the first place. And I understand that AI coding assistants are about to become way more expensive. And I think, Tom, these were stories that you wrote recently. So can you walk us through a bit what's going on with the current, cloud hosted ones?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this sort of began with back in November, there was, I think around Opus 4.5, pretty much all the developers started to realize that these models were actually getting pretty good, and it was no longer
Hmm.
vibe coding was less of a joke and more like, oh, maybe this will work. And then by the time, around February, with the open clock craze, there was a lot more demand for sort of coding agents, and people would start running these for long periods of time. And it sort of caught Anthropic and others unaware, and Google and OpenAI as well. There
Hmm.
was a lot of capacity constraints where a lot of more people were trying these things out, and they ended up having to find ways to limit demand through session limits, and made a lot of people unhappy. But they basically just didn't have the compute available to serve capacity. And on top of that, they're serving a lot of these at a price that is loss leading. They're trying to get
Right.
people into the business, but they're not actually, these are unprofitable workloads for them. And you start, if you look at something like Mythos, which came out, which is their big security model, it was too good for anybody but large companies with expensive payrolls to run.
Right. Right.
uh, it's clear that they're looking for ways to increase their revenue because, they're investing a lot in the infrastructure to make this run, but they don't yet have sort of the recurring revenue that justifies all this. I mean, the ramps look good. They're bringing more people on, but
Sure.
they've invested a lot of money in this.
Oh,
And so
yeah. I mean, well, what OpenAI famously has never actually turned a profit in its history. And I don't know about Anthropic personally, but I can't imagine they're doing a whole lot better. And so I understand the two specific examples you had was that Anthropic recently, right? Is Anthropic yanked Claude code from Pro plans, but only for some people. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, that was, and they wrote that off as an A/B test. I mean, basically,
Okay.
they were doing live A/B testing, and people noticed, and they were saying, "Oh, well, no, that's not doesn't apply to everyone. We're not going to take it away from existing pro users." But
Hmm.
clearly, there was someone there saying, "Hey, can we get away with charging this much but providing less service?" Um,
Right.
and
Yeah.
that doesn't happen unless you're trying to figure out a way to increase your revenue and reduce the demand on your services. So
Totally. Did they backtrack on that at all, or is that A/B test still going on?
I don't think it's still
Yeah,
going. I think
they
it's
they they do really do a lot of A/B testing. I think I
Sure.
have
Yeah.
a Claude Code Max subscription that is about like, has a 50% discount on it right now. So I'm a little hesitant to give it up because, yeah, it's $100 a month, and I don't use it nearly enough to justify that. But also, if I cancel and decide I wanted it back, it'd be 200.
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, that's the reason I'm still an NVIDIA GeForce Now gaming cloud subscriber, right? Because I was there in the beta test, and I'm never giving that discount up, even if I haven't used it in a while. So I understand. So Claude did that, Anthropic did that, and then GitHub also has just straight up jumped to metered billing for AI, I think, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they were taking a huge loss on things because they would give you a flat rate, but then people would use their the most expensive models, and of course those things are billed at different rates, and
Hmm.
offering a flat rate versus these very inflated Opus 4.7 models, which also take a lot longer to process stuff, even if they're a little bit more efficient. Um, they'll think for longer periods. It's just they're losing money, so everyone has to go to meter billing, and once that happens, it's going to cost people a lot of money. I mean, uh,
Sure.
and you can look at it now, even on a subscription plan. You write up a little widget and you look at the thing, and it's $2 worth of whatever, and you think, well, maybe is that worth it? Maybe. And then if it's a more substantial project, people spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on stuff, and
Hmm.
if that's not returning you any revenue, are you still going to do that? It's going to be interesting to see how this goes.
Yeah, and that could be the sort of, the sort of maybe local LLMs like what we're here to talk about today are kind of the market control, right? I'm sure there are going to be people who are using these paid services or were at least that are going to say, I don't care what the justification is, whether they're trying to make more money, sure they might deserve to, or whether they just need to reserve compute resources. Either way, right? I can't afford to pay for this, so I'm going local.
Right.
Maybe that'll be the cost control, right? Maybe there'll be some balance that kind of equals out there between we're losing customers, so we got to make this cheaper versus we need to actually get some return on our investment
Yeah.
someday. But I guess either way, right? This discussion is kind of is indicative of why we're talking about using local LLMs, specifically, I believe, coding assistants, which is what the two of you have been kind of spending some time working with. And I understand you've both had success in various ways with this. Let's talk a bit about, I guess, the one large story you wrote this week about local LLMs and just kind of more broadly what you guys think of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we've, many of us on the team have been playing with local LLMs in some shape or fashion for a couple of years now. Um, and probably within the last year, certainly in the last 6 months, it's the models that are small enough that you can run on consumer hardware. And I'm
Hmm.
not talking cheap consumer hardware. I'm talking about high end consumer GPUs, um, you know, quasi workstation mini PCs, higher end MacBooks and Macs. The quality of those models have jumped from being kind of like toys, you know, tech demonstrators, to
Hmm.
being really rather competent. At the same time, we've also seen the rise of these agentic coding frameworks. That's the other part of the equation. These are things like
Hmm.
Claude Code. Claude
Right.
Code is a framework that connects to models running in Anthropic's various data center and cloud providers, and is what's actually orchestrating the generation of the code, the testing of the code, the validation of the code, and allowing developers to kind of uh, use these as actually useful tools rather than just getting a code snippet that may or may not work out of
Hmm.
a model, as you might have done with ChatGPT 4 years ago.
Right.
Um, and so we in the last right around the time that Microsoft was going to usage-based billing, and Anthropic was toying around with kicking the $20 a month pro users off of the cloud code entirely to save on compute. Alibaba's Quen team popped in with a relatively small 27 billion parameter uh, LLM that they said was
Relatively small. I just think it's funny how quick the parameters have grown over the years. Oh, it's small. It's only a few billion, you know?
Yeah, it's only 27 billion. Uh, they popped in and they presented this as being frontier quality coding out of a pretty small model. And so with all of the agent harnesses you need to do this, and now a model that is supposedly competent, it was just kind of the perfect storm, so to speak, to start looking into whether or not these small models could be a replacement for some part of the development flow, for the entire
Hmm.
development flow. And it's surprising just how good these small models have gotten.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've was experimenting just recently with the Quen, I think it's the 3.6, and it's like whatever 35 billion parameters,
Yeah,
and
there's a 35 and a
it's
27 billion, I believe, yeah.
five, but it's like a mixture of experts, so it's actually only like 3 billion, I think, when it's running, and um, it's an 8-bit quantization, and it's working, pretty speedily. And I was doing a sort of comparison test to see whether it would do a drag and drop metadata removal app on a Mac, which is like a very particular kind of thing. And initially, it kind of suggested some things that were wrong, and I sort of cross checked that with Claude and OpenAI, and they both came up with things that were like not really right either. And um, it then when I sort of rephrased the question to it more carefully, it came up. They basically came up with the same answer with Claude, and what it tells me is, to your point about the harnesses, I think a lot of the things that make these that makes local coding work is how good the local harness is. And this was a point that came up yesterday in a piece I was working on about Mozilla when they were talking about all the bugs they fixed with Mythos. One of the people I was talking to, Davi Ottenheimer, argued pretty strongly that you can do Mythos quality work with a much smaller model as long as you have a good harness. And unfortunately, a lot of the setup of that is very kind of, just unclear. There's not like a standard way to do it. So people will either figure out a way that makes it work or they'll set something up and it just doesn't work. But it's not really clear why that happens. And there's a lot of sort of arcana about like what skills you have and what the pipeline looks like. It, people are still figuring it out, but I think that local is where it will go because there's nothing that, beats the price of being able to run this for, next to nothing, excluding your very expensive hardware.
And it's improving to the point where it's not something that it would have like a while ago it was like, this doesn't really work. Now
Yeah.
we're reaching the point where these local models are viable, right?
Yeah.
Well, like you said, you've got to word things carefully.
Right.
But like I mean that feels like anything that was the early days of AI, right? It's like, okay, you got to word it carefully, but eventually it's going to get better to the point where it's not going to have to be so particular and you get the same results hopefully.
Yeah, there are two key technologies that I think have really helped these smaller models compete. The first is, as Tom mentioned, is mixture of expert models. They only use a subset of the total parameter account for each token generated, which reduces the barrier to entry for hardware.
Okay.
The larger the models get, the more memory bandwidth you need, and in a kind of consumer even workstation class of product, it gets absurdly expensive as your memory bandwidth requirements increase.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, even for doing some of the basic ones here, I think you wrote in your story that the things you need, you need an M5 Mac with 32 gigabytes of memory, right? Like, or 24 gigabytes with multiple GPU. Like, you need a beefy machine
Right.
from the consumer perspective to run this stuff. I mean, like, I've got a 16. I was looking up like, oh, I've got an M1 map. I wonder if I could run some of these. And I look up like my Mac's pretty fast. I haven't needed to think about upgrading it in several years.
Yeah.
And I looked at him, just like, oh yeah, there's no way.
So yeah, older Macs can do it. It's you will run into issues where um, processing the prompt processing side of that. That's the you
Hmm.
hit enter on your prompt and then you wait. Um, it gets to be problematic. Like you're talking
Hmm.
several minutes of waiting for it to start generating a response because older Macs lacked the matmul acceleration necessary for this. So they were brute forcing a lot of the compute on the GPU.
Hmm.
Starting with the M5 Max, they integrated the matmul acceleration into the GPU. It makes a huge difference in terms of performance. So that's why we recommended newer Macs. We did, Tom and I think we're both testing on older M series on Macs, and yes, it can work, and especially with the 35 billion parameter mixture of expert model, it's a little bit better, but the quality
Hmm.
is generally worse than the dense uh, 27 billion parameter model.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can understand that, right? I mean, the more processing you can get done, the faster, the better the response.
And that's a really important part of this because the other piece, the thing that has changed that the models are that small models can be this competitive is something
Hmm.
called test time scaling. We saw this first with DeepSeek and OpenAI o1, which is this, you hit enter on your prompt and then you see the model thinking.
Right.
And the model can work through different paths and then choose which path it wants to present to the user at the end. Um, so the idea behind test time scaling is that you can take a smaller model and have it think for longer in order to make up for the lack of parameters in that
Okay.
model.
Cool.
And so we have both of those things coming together in models like Quen 3.6 27B or Quen 3.6 35B.
Right. Now, I mean, for those who are interested in setting this up and go, okay, I've got some hardware that's beefy enough, and I think I'm willing to give this a shot. I mean, This has also gotten a lot easier. Like I think in the past year, year and a half, 2 years, it's also gotten multiple factors of simplicity easier to actually set up one of these things and run them locally. Is that accurate to say? It seems like it's gotten a lot simpler to configure this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're definitely. I mean, people often use Olama or was it Unsloth or I'm using OMLX, which is uses the Mac MLX acceleration, and these are basically the model serving platforms. I mean, you can get your model from a variety of places. Hugging Face is a very common one, but
Hmm.
a lot of the model platforms like Olama will fetch the model for you and handle all the installation stuff. The trick,
Hmm.
a lot of them have different formats, and if you're using Llama CCP directly on your computer, which is the C-based, model runner, it's going to have a different format than, say something else, and they'll all, talk to each other, but it tends to lock you into one particular way of doing it, and you get used to it. And there's not really a right way of doing it right now, and that's part of the problem is everyone's kind of figuring out like what's the right way to do this, which one do I want to use, how do I configure it, and even just looking at the model and trying to decipher the quantization and the features it has isn't always clear to everybody, and
Oh,
um, that I think hopefully will become more standardized as you get sort of more common knowledge about, oh yeah, this one works really well for me. I mean, if
Hmm.
you go on the forums every week, there's someone saying, oh yeah, this model is great for XYZ, and
Hmm.
we'll try that out. But I mean, that's really the experience you have to have is figure out what you're going to use it for, and try it and see what other people are doing, and you can probably arrive at something that's useful locally.
Yeah,
right.
useful locally, I guess, also implies the need to do probably some security legwork, right? I know when we first started writing about local LLMs, things like OpenClaw, right? I mean, the going headline for any of those, right, was, "Oh, this local LLM has caused chaos for somebody again,"
Yeah.
right? Is that I think, Tom, you wrote a couple stories recently about, running local LLMs safely. I mean, has it gotten to the point where it's easier to do that safely, or is that still gonna be a big concern for anyone doing this?
It is easier to do. I mean, the setup is pretty complicated for these anyway. I mean, I just spent an evening building a sandbox for the Pi agent because
Mhm.
Pi is it's sort of a very permissive agent that comes out of the box as in YOLO mode. It can sort of do anything.
Right.
It has very limited command set, but it has very few limitations, and that's by design. It's sort of like in the same way that Flask is a very open Python framework. It's not the sort of batteries included thing, of
Mhm.
compared to Django, but um, you know, something like Claude will come with a bunch of sort of predefined ways to do things. Claude has its own sort of sandboxing system, and you can add a lot of safety through things like hooks. There are people who
Mhm.
will write little hooks that will intercept dangerous commands like RM. So there's a lot of ways to do it. Docker has a sandboxing system. That's what I tried to build on is basically figure out a way to do a Docker sandbox that runs Pi, and it protects the local file system, but leaves the internet space open. And those are kind of the security decisions you have to make because if this thing is totally enclosed in a VM and there's no way out, it can't really do anything. I mean, you can do
Right.
anything that you stick into the VM, but if you wanted to like work on project on your own system, you have to break that boundary somehow to get the file across and give it access. And then, if you need to update something, you have to open it up to a code repo somewhere. So there are a lot of security decisions you have to make. And for me, the biggest one was just like making sure it doesn't mess with my local files. And that
Right.
gives me a little bit more
Right.
confidence to run a model that, I don't really know how well it will perform. I mean, having run Claude for a long time, I'm a little bit more confident that it, is behaves well, but the risk is there for all of them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we looked at, I think, three different agent harnesses in the piece. Claude Code, which you would think is for work with Anthropic stuff, but it works just fine with local models. It's two
Hmm.
additional commands and you're up and running. It's very heavy.
Mhm.
The system prompt is enormous, and so if you have lesser hardware, you're going to be you might struggle a little bit with it. We also looked at Klein, which is a VS Code extension that it's very easy to install, pretty fast to configure. And then we looked at Pi coding agent, which Tom had suggested that we discuss as well. And with out of the box, Claude Code and Klein both default to user in the loop, kind of deny by default kind of situations where it'll ask for permission before performing any commands or writing any code. It'll say, "I
Mhm.
want to write this code. What do you think? Do you want to proceed?" And but they can be made to go fully automatic and just say,
Right.
"I'm not worried. YOLO, let's go." And so that model is a different security model than what we saw with like Pi coding agent, which to Tom's point is just pure YOLO mode out of the box. And so the security models differ wildly depending on which agent harness you're using or which sandbox that you're trying to play in, so to speak. Uh,
Mhm.
there are several kind of agent sandboxes that have emerged that default to blocking all outbound network activity, which really limits the capabilities of the agent and forces you to be deliberate about what you do and don't want it talking to. Others are just they're focused on isolating, doing kind of limiting the blast radius if the agent decides to go AWOL and do RM, RF, the root file structure and just take the whole thing out.
Yeah.
That's fine if it's in a container and it destroys the container because you run 2 commands and you're back up and running again. Um, it's less okay if you're running bare metal.
Mhm. Yeah. So I mean, I guess right. So security considerations. It seems like the core is basically just know what you're working with, right? Like don't deploy an agent that you don't at least have some idea how the security apparatus built into it functions by default, right? And just what you can do with it. But I guess whether we think about security or not, a lot of the conversation around the need to run LLMs locally seems to boil down to compute resources and the cost to maintain them, the cost to operate them, the cost to serve them. And I guess Anthropic, speaking of Claude, right? Anthropic's big long shot this week, I guess, was a plan or a partnership they signed with SpaceX to occupy some space on the fleet of orbital data centers that Elon Musk seems intent on building. Tom, so is that going to happen?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would think that they would put them in the ocean before they would put them in space, and they talk about
You'd think.
data centers, but I I think that I'll wait and see if they actually build them on land first, because there's a lot of terrestrial construction that is planned and hasn't happened,
Hmm.
and we'll
Yeah.
see.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
whole idea is that in space, if you put the satellites in a sun synchronous orbit, then they have basically unlimited power. The problem is that you have to get them there in the first place, which you need a launch vehicle for, which last I checked, Starship still does not work.
I was
Um,
gonna say this seems awfully familiar to me if we just change orbital data centers to Mars
Yeah,
colonization, right? Like, same problem here. We gotta have a vehicle that can get us there yet, and we do not.
right. Well,
uh,
the hyperloop will be they'll take it out there, right?
Yeah, right.
Right. A and once we get the orbital cluster in place, Elon wants to put a mass driver on the moon so that
Yeah.
we can put even more of these things into deep space for reasons, I guess.
Yeah, it just seems like there's a lot of I don't know, it feels like the idea that Anthropic is gonna, get on board with these SpaceX data centers in orbit, and I don't know, it feels to me a lot like when, a data center company is like, "Hey, we just signed a huge deal with this company that makes nuclear reactors that don't exist yet." And it's kinda like, "Cool, guys. Well, like, let us know when we've actually got a real solution for the compute crisis that you guys are dealing with right now that you caused." Um,
Yeah, I
it's
kind of
just
interpret
yeah.
that. Yeah, I kind of interpret the whole space thing as like, oh, we made a deal with SpaceX, and we have to say something nice about their future plans.
Right.
You know,
Right. Because this really
Yeah,
boils down to Anthropic is getting access to Colossus 1, this
right.
massive, 150 megawatt AI factory, purpose built
Mhm.
for GPU training and inference. And so, um, I think really what they need is compute, and
Yeah.
they cannot get enough of it. The inflection point has hit, and we're seeing adoption, which means we need compute for inference, and we need more compute for inference than we've had in the past.
Mhm.
And so I think really what this is we'll say whatever you want. We will say that we will ride along on your starship into the heavens and live in your space data centers. Just give us access to Colossus, please, because we're dying for compute.
We need it now, and it'd be great if it happens someday in orbit, right? So, in the meantime, I guess basically, have we reached the point where localized AI, local LLM coding agents, right? Um, are we at the point now where they might be able to ease some of the compute stress that these companies are feeling, or is this still early days, something that's going to have to be developed? Not worth it for the average developer.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
think there's Go
yeah,
ahead,
I
Tom.
think they're going to be useful for um, sort of prototyping stuff.
Hmm.
One of the things I've done is, I'll run it through the local one, and then I'll have Claude check it, and
Hmm.
that you often get a lot of code fixes that way. So it is a way to offload some like less important jobs. I mean, you don't need a frontier model for everything.
Right. Right. I
Yeah.
think that was kind
So
of an argument you made, Tobias, about using a massive data center to build an HTML page is not a good use of resources, right?
right, right. Using the biggest, baddest model to write some HTML is probably not the most efficient thing to do, and it's certainly well within the capabilities of these small models.
Hmm.
The other thing I'll say is if you look at how GPT-5 works, if you go to ChatGPT, not Codex, um, when you first enter a prompt, it gets routed to one of three models. Based on the complexity of that model. Conceivably, we could do the same thing with local models where
Hmm.
you sign into Codex, it does a check. If you have sufficient hardware, it will run some portion of that query through the local model, do a yes no check on the big model in the cloud, and decide whether or not at that point whether or not it needs to be regenerated via the API or it can move forward with what's generated locally. So there's definitely a path forward for this uh, for local playing a bigger role in reducing the amount of compute required to scale it inference.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the only key caveat there would be that if you're going to install local LLMs on people's machines to split your compute load, you should probably let them know first, right, Google?
You probably should. Um,
Probably. Or you can just do it and ask for forgiveness later on. Who's going to uninstall Chrome? You? Right?
yeah. The other thing I would point out is that you know while a 24 or 32 gigabyte GPU is very expensive, we're talking anywhere from 1,000 to $4,000 plus for
Hmm.
GPUs with that memory. Those GPUs could serve that model to an entire team
Right.
realistically. And so if you were thinking about this from an enterprise adoption standpoint, you could buy one machine that sits in the corner, is basically silent, that could serve an entire dev team with this smaller model. Or you could spend a whole lot more, but still something that fits on a desktop in the corner that runs a big model, like a trillion parameter model locally on that system and for that team. So we're not just limited to these small models. You and I might be, but from an
Hmm.
enterprise standpoint, a $70,000 DGX station, for example, is capable of running very large models, trillion parameter scale models. And that's less than the cost of one developer for a year.
Yeah. So maybe that's the case now, right? Maybe we've just reached a point where there's enough value in these local models as a sort of, like you say, like as a prototyping test bed, as a entry level dev replacement, to do the first work before someone more experienced or with more parameters reviews it. Yeah. So we might be there. That's interesting. I will be interested to see how the evolution of AI models, and like you said, the kind of linking between cloud-based versus local. I'll be interested to see how that develops. It could be the next phase of kind of the AI industry's Evolution. We'll see. We'll see. Something's got to give with compute, right? No matter what it is, we are going to be sure we're here on the Register to write about it and here at the Kettle to talk about it. And until then, we will see you next week on the next episode.